it sounds really good and it's great for a lot of thrust. What it does is it creates massive drag. It's a big airplane, a huge airplane. And now it's just taking it and moving it across the sky. So what happens is, while it can move its nose around, it starts sinking. Well, what do? Well, we've been fighting the Raptor, getting our butts kicked, and we go, the only chance you have against the Raptor is when he's in a turn and he's coming around the corner and you have an inexperienced guy, because the experienced guys know not to get there, but the inexperienced guy has got, and this is no shit, 28 degrees per second turn rate at 20,000 feet. The F-15 has an instantaneous of 21, a sustained of about 15 to 16 degrees. The Raptor can sustain 28 degrees. Some of these young guys, that's not enough for them. They want more than that. So they'll come around the corner, and here you are in your ego just kind of hoping that he gets scared. You're pointing your nose out here, and he pulls to the point that he goes post-stall maneuvering. Well, once he goes post-stall, the airplane stops moving around the center of lift on the wing, and it goes around the center of gravity up by the nose because it goes on just thrust. And the ass end drops down, and the airplane will rotate like this. Well, in the Eagle or the Viper, when you see that, you immediately go vertical because you know he's not going to be able to go up with you. And you have one fleeting opportunity against the Raptor, and that's it. Now, the real key is you never even get that close to the Raptor because you never see him, and he shoots you before you get there. The F-22, no problem. Big airplane, big radar cross-section. He's jinking and jiving just to get to the merge, but he's jamming. So yeah, your missiles aren't working, so you get to this visual fight. Well, you roll in on him, and he's got about 22 degrees, 23 degrees per second sustained turn. Nowhere near the Raptor. Well, we've been fighting the Raptor, so we go, yeah, okay, oh, dude, this is easy. So we start to pull in on him, and then all of a sudden you see the ass end kick down, and he starts doing vector thrust, but now he starts falling out of the sky. He's falling out of the sky so fast that you don't even have to go up. You just pull the stick back a little bit, pull the throttles, go to guns, and come in and drill his brains out. And so
Welcome to Beer Thunder. The year is 2026. It is the summer. I am actually coming to you from the very distant future to astral project a message back into the past to tell you that Gaijin has finally added the F-22, and due to their anti-American and pro-Russian biases, they have artificially nerfed the plane into the ground because they have ignored very credible reports that the plane is capable of sustaining 28 degrees per second sustained turn at 20,000 feet. The video that you saw was a debriefing from a United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School graduate and instructor telling you exactly what the plane is capable of. This is a debriefing that anyone can go look up, and these numbers are 100% credible. They're directly from the Air Force. But Gaijin has decided, because of the fact that they just hate America, okay? They just hate America. You have to understand this, that the plane itself is only capable of sustaining around 16 to 17 degrees per second at 20,000 feet, which is just a complete fabrication. It's complete nonsense. They basically have taken the lowest possible number that they can get and added that to the game. And let me prove it, because we're back here in our Excel spreadsheet. We're back here in our F-22 turn rate calculator, and we're gonna talk about how we can actually prove that this 28 degree per second number is actually real. So first off, these numbers here, we go to our thrust rating here, but this thrust, this 72,000, is actually a lowball estimate that's based on a Wikipedia value, because we don't actually know what the thrust of the F-22 is. We just know the very low end for afterburner. So going down this rabbit hole, I actually went out and I gathered some sources, and I can prove it to you beyond a shadow of a doubt. So here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to go down here. I got some sources. So right down here we have the Wikipedia values, and the Wikipedia values just say it's greater than 35,000. So what I've done for 72,000, it's 36,000 times 2. This is a low ball estimate, and this gives us a thrust to weight ratio in afterburning of 7-to-1. However, there is a declassified CIA report called France's SNEMCA, Tough New Competitor in Advanced Propulsion Systems. And if we go to this document, we actually go through and read it, we're actually going to see something really interesting, because this is an old report, and the CIA kind of gives away the plot on the F-22. In the report, we see this little snippet here. This is on page whatever the fuck it is. Who the fuck knows? I don't give a shit. I ain't reading all this fucking thing. But the Mark I prototype engine of the M88 ran in January 1984 that achieved a thrust-to-weight ratio of 8.3 to 1, which is about the equivalent of a 1970s U.S. engine. Some U.S. industry experts are skeptical of Snemka's ability to meet the target 10-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio for the Mark II. With anticipated design material changes, blah, blah, Snemka, blah, 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 who cares? This is all pertaining to the Rafale's engine. However, the CIA has given away the plot and says these thrust-to-weight targets are still some years behind the projected 12-to-1 for U.S. engines in development and significantly behind the longer-range target of 20-to-1 thrust-to-weight of the U.S. Air Force for the turn of the century. So that means that our number up here that we can reference, this 36,000, 35,000 number, corresponds to a 7-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio. Well, in order to actually get this and convert it from a 7-to-1 to a 12-to-1, we have to actually multiply it by either this factor here of 1.7. That will give us an equivalent of a 12-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio. If we want to go all the way up to 20-to-1, we're going to have to go to 2.86. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to adjust our values in the calculator. Now, because we know that the Air Force claim is 28 degrees per second at 20,000 feet, we do need to set our air density to basically the air density equivalent in slug foot for 20,000 feet. So this 1267 is over here. If we go over here and we look at 20,000 feet, we see that 1267, that is the number that we need for the input in the calculator. And then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go up here and go to the thrust modifier. So instead of a 1 thrust modifier, we're going to have to take this number down here, which is 1.7. So we're going to modify this thrust by 1.7. That will give us our low-end output. And then if we go up here and we modify this one to our high-end output, the one that is the most realistic, mind you, because it's the biggest number I can find, and plug it into the calculator, we're going to go 2.83. And there you go. We got our turn rates modified. So the very low end of what the F-22 should do is going to be 22.98 degrees per second at 20,000 feet. The actual realistic value is actually 30.25 degrees per second when loaded into dogfighting configuration with basically one half of its stores. There you go. Thank you very much. I've just proven in the future that Gaijin is going to artificially nerf the F-22 and ignore evidence because all of these are marketing claims. Now, if you actually paid attention to this and actually kind of like followed along here, you might think and go, Squish, that was kind of like 3 separate ass pulls that you just strung a bunch of stuff together to prove a point that I don't know if I believe you, and I don't know if I believe that you believe what you're saying, because the other F-22 video seemed a lot more reasonable and conservative, and now it just seems like you just went and made a couple of leaps of logic and maybe misunderstood some things and plugged some stuff in to justify this gigantic 30 degree per second at 20,000 feet number. Because guess what happens when we take this 30 degrees per second number and go back to sea level? We have to take our density and go from this to 2377. So we'll go over here and let's go down here and let's get our low end estimate of like what the F-22 should do. So 2377, boom, 39 degrees at sea level. That's the high end. Now we go back here, 2377, 30 degrees, sustained turn rate at sea level is the low end. So if Gaijin adds the F-22 in the future and they don't meet either of these numbers, basically 30 degrees or 39 degrees, Gaijin is artificially nerfing the plane based on the sources that I have, that I just basically strung fucking 3 things together, pulled them out of my ass, ran up through some numbers here, and this is what we got, and this has the thinnest amount of plausibility. And that gets us to the Rafale. Yep, that means I want to talk about the Rafale's turn rate and how we got to the point where we are at today and what it reveals about the War Thunder community as a whole, because I think this whole entire story is rather insightful and is rather interesting and will provide perspective on the way that I perceive things. And by the end of this video, you will probably be incredibly frustrated with the state of the game and the state of certain elements of the community. So like any good story, we're going to start this one in the beginning, skip to the end, and then go back to the middle and really try to flesh everything out, because I think that's maybe the best way to approach this. But this is going to be one of them long, rambly, wandering around videos. In the beginning of around November, December of last year, when the Rafale was first added to the game, a user named Zafe made this bug report. And this bug report covers the sustained turn rate of the Rafale and makes the claim that it is underperforming. Now, attached to this report are a couple of different sources, but really the one that Gaijin ends up going for, and this is the first time that they've ever done this for any plane, is that they have gone for the section that has analyzed the plane based on an airshow performance. The other sources that are attached to this are a blurb in an Austrian marketing brochure that has nothing to do with Dassault. There's a pilot interview, which I'm showcasing here, and then there is the Air Murchie chart, which is a source that Gaijin has already used in the past, that a lot of us have already seen, that was one that came up during the discussion of the Gripen. What Gaijin goes for in this report is this video here and the frame-by-frame analysis of this video done by Zafe. Basically, this is a 2018 airshow performance in France where there's a couple of moments in the video where you can kind of see the performance of the airplane and make some assumptions about it. And what Zafe does in his report is he claims that you can't really deduce what the fuel load is based on the HUD footage. Therefore, the most logical thing to do is to just index all of the performance aspects to 50% fuel, and that would be congruous with maybe some of the claims in the Austrian marketing brochure and serves to increase the sustained turn performance of the plane. Gaijin accepts this logic, it goes through, and the plane's turn rate gets increased by about 3 degrees per second. And nobody really questions this logic for around 6 months. Nobody goes back and looks at the bug report to actually see if all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. At the same time, I end up making a bug report on the Su-27 trying to use HUD footage to substantiate my claims as well as an airshow performance, and it gets rejected because I haven't attached any tertiary sources that are redundant or something. So my report doesn't go through because it's just HUD footage, and Gaijin doesn't index to HUD footage, except for the one time that they did, which was this time. And this logic holds up until about June, when the conventional Carls, that's the nom de guerre that I'm going to use for me and all of my triangleoid-hating friends, goes back and actually looks at this footage. Because at the time I was gathering a bunch of Rafale HUD footage to try to analyze the bleed rates to get a general approximation of what the specific excess power should be, yada, yada, yada. And what happened is Piet goes back to this report. He ends up looking at it, and we notice something. And what we notice is that during the performance, the bingo fuel warning comes on. So for people that don't know, bingo fuel is basically a low fuel warning that you can set to the plane. It will tell you that basically, hey, you've flown half the distance from the base, and this is what you need to return. You should, turn around now. It's an adjustable warning. That by itself doesn't undermine the logic of the report. That doesn't by itself undermine indexing the plane to 50% fuel. What does undermine it, though, is that during the performance, when the pilot goes to land, he adjusts the bingo fuel indicator. So it means that you see the bingo fuel indicator go from 800, and he dials it down to 500, and then it disappears. Which means at that point of the video, when the bingo fuel warning comes on, it can be assumed that the plane's remaining fuel was 800 of somethings, and the French use kilograms. And if you assume that the 800 means kilograms, which is the unit of measurement that the French use for fuel and all of their other planes, it means that you can backwards calculate based on average fuel consumption an estimate of what the fuel load of the plane was during its turn performance and during its indexing turn. And what this means in a practical sense is that Gaijin took this bug report and made the plane perform at 50% fuel like the real plane does when it's flying around with 15 to 20% fuel. I actually pointed this out to my audience a couple weeks ago in my video about the new update, but I didn't go into as great of detail about it. Prior to this, I'd also pointed this out to one of the most prolific Rafale bug reporters, direct support, in direct messages. And I had pointed out that the bingo fuel warning comes on, and I'd also sent him the pictures of the bingo 800 warning. It's not until early July that this revelation about the fuel warning on the HUD during the airshow footage actually makes its way to the forums and makes its way into the Eurofighter versus Rafale discussion. And once this happens, things happen relatively quickly. Basically, a guy posts my claim, and then Mythic Pi goes and he posts a screenshot, and almost immediately after that, Gunjob, one of the technical mods, makes an internal bug report based on this revelation that the bingo fuel warning comes on. And this is where things get stupid. This is where things get nasty, because what the Rafale community does, including the bug reporter that I have sent the bingo 800 warning to and shown it to him explicitly, go into damage control mode and do everything in their power to cast doubt upon the significance of the bingo fuel warning in the HUD footage of the air show. Visender ends up posting this HUD footage of a Rafale landing on an aircraft carrier at night with the bingo fuel warning on and 2,300 kilograms of fuel indicated. Therefore, logically, the bingo fuel warning for the Rafale at the air show also corresponds to 2,300 kilograms. Direct support finds this new piece of evidence so compelling that he begins to argue that the plane should have been indexed to 60 to 70% of fuel instead of 50% of fuel, and that this new piece of evidence is actually proof that it is underperforming, that it needs to be buffed even more. At one point, he even tries to see the argument that the air show could have been conceivably performed without the use of its afterburner, and if that was the case, the plane's performance would have been even more significantly lowballed by Gaijin. And really what this amounts to is trying to recontextualize this pretty substantial buff that happened around Christmas time into something that's relatively minor. Basically, we could have asked for more. We should have asked for more. We should have got even more performance than we did. And you guys should be grateful that we are not asking for more. Keep in mind, this position is coming from a guy who has been aware of the bingo 800 warning since around the middle of June. He finds this new piece of HUD footage to be so compelling somehow that he DMs it to me basically as soon as it's posted on the War Thunder forums, claiming that he looked into my concerns about the Rafale and that he came to a real conclusion that no, bingo fuel is actually at 2,300 kilograms, even though the previous evidence explicitly shows bingo 800. And if you actually watch the footage, you would know that bingo fuel is a level that's adjustable. It's at this point that it becomes readily apparent that the Rafale community, i.e. direct support and other people that post on the forums, are going to do everything in their power to discredit this internal bug report that's filed by Gunjob. And the problem with an internal report is we don't know what is contained in it as like public War Thunder players. We don't have like an inside track. I don't know what's actually in it. And this causes me to formulate my own bug report, because my assumption going into this, based on what everyone is saying in the forums, is they've noticed that the bingo warning has came on, but nobody has pointed out that the pilot adjusts it down from 800 down to 500 kilograms and it clears. And if the Gunjob report does not contain this information, it means that this attempt at discrediting the report based on just the information that the bingo fuel warning comes on could have been successful. So I go out and I make my own report. I kind of like half-ass it, and my bug report gets accepted pretty quickly because I have the power of twinks in high places. No, in reality, my bug report gets attached to the Gunjob report, and my bug report exists mainly as a forcing function, where if you make a bug report that's public, that isn't an internal report, the developers, if it's accepted, will have to respond to it. It also means that the knowledge about the bingo fuel warning being adjustable and also the knowledge about the specific warnings coming up and being adjusted down also end up into the public lexicon. That in and of itself was extremely worthwhile because it did a lot to undermine the narrative that direct support and his friends were trying to formulate, whose whole entire purpose was to prevent the bug report from going through and to prevent the Rafale from receiving its first ever nerf. Keep in mind, the guy that was trying to carry this narrative home, to get it just across the finish line, was the guy that I shared the bingo fuel warning with 2 weeks beforehand, and the guy that I shared the 800 kilogram bingo fuel warning 2 weeks beforehand, who apparently decided to completely ignore this. And at this point, 20 minutes into the video, you might be like, hey, Squish, you're implying that this guy is arguing in bad faith. It seems like you're kind of trying to dance around that point. Well, we've got there, And I'm not dancing around the point. I'm explicitly stating that. I am explicitly stating that direct support, the guy that makes most of the Rafale bug reports, is actually publicly facing, arguing in bad faith. Basically, he is making claims, making statements, and doing things publicly and claiming to believe things that he doesn't actually believe. Now, I know this to be true because about a month ago when the AIM-120C was on the dev server, he tried to lobby for me to support buffing the range of the Mica, and this is a DM that's kind of an outcropping of that conversation, because my point at the time was like, we don't know what the AIM-120C is going to be. We don't know how it's going to be in the game. We don't know if it's actually going to move the needle. Like, I have no reaction to it. I made my own video about it, basically in response to this kind of reasoning of like, I got a guy in my DMs lobbying for me to support something based on my reputation of just hating the Eurofighter, which is fair, but is also a huge misinterpretation, a huge misread of my kind of core personality. So starting from the top, direct support. I would argue that behaving reasonably gets you behind, and behaving unreasonably like a whiny major nation main gets you ahead in terms of content addition, balance consideration, etc. The issue lies in the way that Gaijin set up their feedback system. According to Smin, this feedback system is based on the most popular feedback in total numbers rather than the most popular feedback, blah, 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 tech tree, blah, blah, blah. This result class, blah, blah. Minor nations suffer, major nations get better stuff. And then we kind of go to the next message, because I'm not going to read my own stuff. That's boring as hell. I'll let someone else rebuttal and make me sound like a fucking nerd. But anyways, Direct Support says, instance of power creep from minor nations is not a non-zero amount, but is significantly less than instances for major nations. F-14, MiG-29 with R-27ER, MiG-23 MLD. The list goes on. That list is only actually 3 fucking planes. And, of course, minor nations of certain points have dominated, such as the UK Phantom being one of the only ones with a pulse Doppler radar at the time, if I remember correctly. I think the UK Phantom, dominated for, fucking 2 months? I think it was, actually, super duper minor because, multipath was 100 meters, so, I don't know, just fucking fly low and cope. Anyways, it goes on. Major nations typically receive better treatment, blah, 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 blah. Premium editions, better BR placements to, again, gain feedback. Germany is getting the Iris-T, the fucking surface launch missile piece of shit. And I point out, hey, dude, no, this is actually, you're fucking cherry picking. The first 4th generation plane to come after the F-14A, if you want to call the F-14A a 4th generation fighter, was the Mirage 2000. Literally, France got its fucking, super duper plane way before anyone else did. The MiG-29 did come out, and it was largely offset by the F-16. At the same time, China had the J-7E. The J-7E had a good period where it was the best plane in the game. At the same time, when the F-16 came out and the MiG-29 came out, Germany didn't fucking get one for a solid update, where the only one was the Russian one. And you'd be like, well, that's Russian bias, which, whatever, fair, I guess. At the same time, fucking everyone and their mother ended up with an F-16. And the F-16, the only thing that was really wrong with it, upon its introduction, the one thing that kind of held it back was the implementation of the G-limiter. Where if we just got rid of that, it would have been fine. Nobody would have had the same issues that they had with the MiG-29. At the same time, the major nation mains of USSR, there was a point where there were Russian mains like MiG-23 ML and Ziggy 1989 arguing on the old War Thunder forums that the R-27ER wasn't good enough, and the flight model on the MiG-29, the old one, the good one, the one that we all want back, wasn't good enough, and therefore it should get the lore accurate R-73 that can't be flared, which was fucking dumb. I will go back to that and I will die on the hill. I'll say that was a fucking stupid point. And at the time, I fought against that. At the time, I told everyone, hey, no, the F-16 didn't need the G limiter because it wasn't consistent with the simulation in the game. But hey, that doesn't matter. Nobody cares about that. Nobody gives a shit about that, because if you go back and actually look at the facts and look at everything over the totality of the game and try to prescribe any kind of rhyme or reason to whatever the fuck Gaijin does, you won't be able to, because there isn't a rhyme or reason to it. It's all just kind of like random shit of like, well, we're going to throw something to the wall and see what sticks. You can see the same thing here, by the way, where in private he is willing to acknowledge that the Rafale is currently the best plane in the game by a wide margin, where if no changes happen to it, it will still continue to probably be the most effective plane in the game for the foreseeable future. His public-facing persona, at the same time, is the guy that is advocating for a buff to the Micah's range and a buff to the Micah's time to impact. Basically, where, in his estimation, the thing that he needs to be advocating for is that the Micah should be the best missile in the game, not just in close range maneuverability, not just in having half the notch gate of everything else, but also should be superior to everything else in terms of time to target and range. More or less, that is my interpretation of it, because I can never actually pin this guy down on a specific percentage that he wanted the Micah to be increased by. Because when you did pin him down on it, he said that it should have basically the long-range kinematics of a PL-12. Which in game it basically already does. There are very, very few situations where the PL-12 is going to have the energy to hit a target that a Micah launch from a similar circumstance is not going to hit a target. There are very few scenarios where the lofting profile of the PL-12 versus the Micah will actually give the PL-12 an advantage, but at the end of the day, this stuff really doesn't matter except for very long-range shots, and it doesn't really change the fact that the Micah overall right now is the best missile in the game, just due to its much lower notch angle, which means that it's much harder to defeat readily and be able to recommit to those like notch fights. That's what makes the Rafale so powerful right now, is that notch gate on the Micah, because you have to play it almost perfectly against it to be able to defeat that missile, when pretty much everyone else's missiles, as long as you're within like that plus or minus like 30-degree mark and you got some chaff out, the missile's going to miss. But that doesn't matter to this guy, because his ultimate goal is to continually buff the Rafale to make it on par with the 5th generation planes whenever they come to the game eventually, because in his mind, the Rafale isn't just like a 4th and a half generation fighter that got shot down in India. It's this like mythical super plane where it is on par with an F-22. It's equal to everything that's the best ever made, because France is obviously understating all of its performance characteristics, which means that the only thing that makes sense is to launder the biggest number possible and plop that in front of the developers and hope that's what they implement. This also cuts the opposite direction when Gaijin accidentally buffs the plane and makes it even more powerful than it already is, that there's some leap of logic that needs to be maintained, that these changes are actually intentional and that they're historically accurate and that there's a basis for them, and that the prospect of 5th generation fighters on the horizon in the distant future is a good reason to perpetually and unintentionally buff the Rafale, and when it is unintentionally buffed, that we should just kind of turn a blind eye to it, because obviously France has suffered enough already. Now, to his credit, he did offer to grease the skids with the tech mods that he knows in order to get my bug report on the radar forwarded even quicker. I didn't really utilize that. I did utilize another connection that I have, because to me, this whole conversation just feels kind of scummy. Anyways, let's get back to that sustained turn rate report, because the attempts to initially discredit it are not successful. Gunjob's report goes through, my report goes through, the devs look at it, they look at the footage, and they recalculate the fuel percentage based on that bingo fuel warning, and that's how they get to their 1,300 kilogram number, because they're taking the point of the video where it flashes bingo fuel saying that that is 800 kilograms, and then just assuming that the minute beforehand where the turn was completed was done at full afterburner. This is kind of like the most generous way to interpret this as far as the possible fuel consumption. You can look at the video and you can see that the plane's not accelerating that much, where it's not likely that they were using full afterburner from the completion of the turn to the landing or whatever, but it is what it is. There's a logic to it and whatever. One of the things to note about the original turn rate report, and one of the things to note about the kind of trying to defend the integrity of it, is that they keep mentioning that more documents are attached to it. And I showed the documents in the beginning. The documents are basically a pilot report, some random blurb in an Austrian marketing brochure that got thrown out, and this Air Murchie chart. Now, one of the things to note about this Air Murchie chart is this is the only document that actually specifies a fuel load. The other thing to notice about it is it's not just a graph of sustained turn rates. It is also a graph of maximum specific excess power. And if you look at the graph, and if you pay really close attention, the F-16A, the MiG-29, and the Rafale are all on the same dot. They all have the same turn rate, and they all have the same specific excess power. Well, how much specific excess power does the Rafale have in game at 50% fuel and at 15,000 feet? And the answer is right around 900 feet per second. This is 200 feet per second greater than the 700 feet per second number that is specified in the Air Murchie document, which means overall the Rafale's acceleration performance, especially at higher speeds, is completely off this chart, at least if you're going to use this chart as a source, which for acceleration, I don't see any of the French mains using it, and I don't see anyone in the French community advocating for a reduction in the plane's acceleration rate. Instead, what happens is after the bug report goes through, direct support begins attacking my credibility on the forums. Basically, that for certain bug reporters like Squishface and Piet by extension, who reported the Rafale's sustained turn rate, he is aware that the MiG-29 is currently overperforming even more than the Rafale was before the upcoming nerf, yet never bug reported. They don't talk about the F-16's overperformance either. So let's talk about this for a second, because many months ago, he sent me this chart that is from a marketing brochure for a MiG trainer that has a turn rate plot that overlays the turn rates of the MiG trainer, the MiG-29, and the F-16C. Keep in mind, this MiG trainer is a subsonic kind of like high-performance aircraft, just meant to kind of like approximate, high-performance fighter jets. It's kind of like a Russian equivalent of like, I don't know, like a T-38 or some crap. But I get this chart, and I go to StatShark, and I overlay the StatShark lines with what's on the chart. And then I go to the game, and I actually test out the MiG-29, because in the past, StatShark has consistently overestimated the performance of the MiG-29 flight model, and what you get in the game and what you get on StatShark ends up being, in my experience, two different things. And that's what the purple line is. So when you look at this chart, and this is a reply to him, because I actually went and did this, and he's seen this chart, by the way. Basically, the MiG-29, as far as sustained turn rate is concerned, at least according to this chart, is actually slightly underperforming in-game. But with the purple line, you can see that Gaijin has somewhat matched the line. I'm sure if you cross-referenced it with the actual flight manual, it's probably accurate for sustained turn rate, or it's probably accurate enough within Gaijin's margin of error where they're not going to change it. Now let's move on to the F-16. With the F-16, I was discussing with him a couple months ago, kind of like the greater context of like how accurate War Thunder flight models end up being to their sourcing documents, and kind of like the margin of errors that it appears that Gaijin maintains. And what I've done in this chart is I've taken the F-16A EM diagram, and I have overlaid the specific excess power outputs from StatShark, basically overlaying one over the other to get a comparison between the two. And what you can see in this chart is that the F-16A, if you use the StatShark outputs, if you believe the StatShark outputs at face value, the F-16A, the Block 15, one of the best F-16s in the game, is actually underperforming at higher speeds in terms of energy retention. Basically, at higher speeds, it's bleeding too much energy too quickly, which is going to reduce the turn performance. And what I've done here is I've made the results a little bit more easy to see. I went back and I recalculated the points and got more accurate points and got them into an Excel spreadsheet. And what you have here is basically a representation of the StatShark EM diagram versus the real EM diagram. The blue lines represent the real one, the red lines represent the StatShark EM diagram. And what you can see here is if we start from the bottom with SEP 0, basically the plane in game at speeds above Mach 0.6 underperforms, and then at speeds below Mach 0.6 it overperforms slightly, so it's kind of like maybe a wash in the end of the day. And it's pretty much the same across the board. At this kind of Mach 0.75 all the way up to 1.0, the plane in game underperforms, and then once you get below Mach 0.7, the plane starts to overperform. So whether or not those kind of overperformances and underperformances equalize, I don't really know. But if someone actually wanted to go out and make a sustained turn rate report and wanted to test at Mach 0.9, this might actually be a pretty easy slam dunk to buff the F-16. I haven't done it, which kind of undermines this idea that I am going out of my way to nerf the trianguloid flight models that I don't like and buff the flight models that I do like. The reason I don't go out of my way to buff or nerf things or make bug reports is because they take time and it takes testing, and it's kind of a pain in the ass to do, and I just don't have the time for it. I don't really want to put in all of that effort when I have a strong feeling that even if you do a report like this, Gaijin is going to say that they have a different EM diagram that corresponds to the Block 10 or a different block of F-16 that doesn't show this kind of like high-speed performance, because there's multiple EM diagrams out there, and I haven't cross-referenced all 3 or 4 of them to see if they all line up with each other perfectly. And I actually confronted him about this, and when I did, he tried to deflect by asking me whether or not I've talked about it publicly in a video, whether or not I've done a video on the MiG-29 overperforming, even though his source shows that it's underperforming when you compare it to in-game, or whether or not I've done a video on the F-16 overperforming in terms of angle of attack limitations. And I'm just going to point this out. I am the only guy on YouTube that I know of that has a 1-hour-long video on fly-by-wire implementation in War Thunder and how it's done accurately to inaccurately and how it affects gameplay. I have mentioned multiple times at length and have gone in depth about fly-by-wire limitations, more so than literally every other War Thunder YouTuber. Anyways, that's going to be a Beer Thunder. Sorry that this one was a little bit light on gameplay. I promise next time I'll do a video that features planes flying around.